goodbye, and I have now the privilege to switch to introduce Professor Daniel Markovits. Hello, Daniel. How are you? Can you hear me well? I saw you on the in the background. Daniel.
I hear you very well. Lovely to see you.
Okay, we hear you very well. Professor Daniel Markovits is Guido Calabresi Professor of Law at Yale Law School, and he's been also the law clerk of Guido Calabresi. And I like to remember that in this faculty because the name of Guido here is very familiar. As Guido was our guest, and we all remember the wonderful talk he gave at the PhD School of the Faculty of Law in Trento a few months before the start of the pandemics in 2019. Professor Markovits is the founding director of the Yale Law School Center for the Study of Private Law. And among books of legal ethics and contract law, Daniel is the author of the widely discussed 2019 book, The Meritocracy Trap: How America's Foundational Myth Feeds Inequality, Dismantle the Middle Class, and Divorce the Elite. This book lays out a persuasive argument about the social cost of the American meritocratic system and how they are born across many different groups in American society. We think that this feature is not only impacting American society, but is affecting, albeit with the different patterns and historical premises, also the Italian society. So, Daniel, thank you again for accepting to join us today. We want to discuss meritocracy with you from the perspective of your book, and also from the perspective of your ongoing work to a book that will be published, I discovered, for Harvard University Press. And I read that will be entitled Snowball Inequality, Meritocracy and the Crisis of Capitalism. Is that correct?
So I don't, that book is what became the Meritocracy Trap. I'm now actually working on a different
sorry,
book
because I went through, as a diligent scholar, I went through your CV and I saw this, I couldn't, so you also told me you were writing working on the topic, so I thought it was a new book. Anyway, my first question goes to this. In your 2019 volume, you made a very harsh criticism of the ideology of meritocracy, a tool that certainly threatened the old elite, but in the end installed a new one in their place, while at the same time blocking social mobility. Meritocratic society, as you describe it, is based above all on the construction and exploitation of human capital, and for this reason, the educational system plays a central role in its analysis. One point that strikes me about your book is the fact that you describe a social organization that has given up presenting itself as aimed at achieving happiness and well-being for those who compose it. This has been a central aspect of political thought since Greek, Roman antiquity, but coming to more recent times, it was also part of the mainstream competing narratives of both the Western and the Soviet blocs in the Cold War years, at least until the 70s. So how do you explain this radical change? The historical disappearance of a different model, the socialist one, and therefore the end of the competition between blocs from this point of view, have a negative effect on the social willingness to consider the goal of achieving happiness and well-being for the larger rate of the individuals who form a society? The question is that there's no willingness to strive to create a theory that really wants to achieve happiness and well-being for the larger rate of population. What do you think about it?
Yeah, first of all, the ideological situation that you describe is very closely connected to some basic facts on the ground. So if you look in the United States, for example, GDP per capita in the United States is maybe 3 times higher today than it was in 1960. poverty, particularly consumption poverty, is maybe 80% lower, so only a fifth as deep as it was in 1960. And yet, if you look in the US and you ask people, are you very unhappy? Roughly 5 times as big a share of the population in the United States today is very unhappy, as was the case in 1960. So over the past 60 years or so, the United States has become much richer on average, much less poor. There are fewer very poor people, and yet it's also become much more unhappy. And that's true not just in sort of self-reported measurements of happiness. If you look at, for example, even before COVID times, life expectancy had started to fall in the United States. And the cause of the decline in life expectancy was overwhelmingly an epidemic of obesity, drug addiction and overdose, alcoholism, and suicide. All deaths of despair. That is to say, forms of internalized unhappiness and anger and self-hatred. So the move away from a politics and a culture that emphasizes flourishing towards one that emphasizes production has very real consequences for the lives that people lead and how they think about their lives and what actually happens to them physically in their lives. Now, why has this change occurred? Well, here's my admittedly still speculative account. If you go back to Adam Smith says towards the end of The Wealth of Nations that the only purpose of production is to promote consumption, and that the only interest that society has in the worker is as the servant of the consumer. And that's not the most famous thing Adam Smith wrote, but it may be the most important or consequential, because it emphasizes the instrumentalization of work life. All right. Now, in a world in which most work wasn't very skilled and almost everybody was very poor, there was a certain moral imperative there, which is that most people couldn't consume enough to be minimally happy. And so making production the servant of consumption answered the demand that people had for being able to consume what they needed to meet their basic material needs. But over the past 250 years, 2 things have happened. First of all, most people have become, by historical standards, actually quite rich. A country like Italy has completely eliminated severe poverty. The United States hasn't quite, because the US social safety net isn't as good. And the second thing that's happened is that the grounds of production have shifted so that the central asset used in production is human capital, the skill and talent and training of free workers. And a regime that says that the only purpose of production is consumption, in which the central productive asset is human capital, is a regime that requires all of its workers to instrumentalize themselves, to exploit their own alienated labor in the service of consumers. And incidentally, when the consumers get wealthy enough, the material and human interests that are being served by the production become much less pressing. And so we have a society in which people are extracting, they're building themselves up and then using themselves up in the service of consumers, rather than viewing their work lives as meaningful in themselves, as opportunities for self-expression, for self-actualization, for making their talents and ambitions real in the world, for doing things that they believe are worthwhile. And the way in which these harms play out in the elite and outside the elite are quite different, but they're unified by this extractive, self-exploitative approach to work, which is a source of great trauma for those who go through it.
Thank you, Daniel. In a way, the second question is connected to what you just said, because we in Italy have already many signs of the penetration of the elements of the meritocratic model, although we are probably in an initial stage or One thing that is already happening is the growing attention in Italy to an educational system capable of transmitting from a very early age the so-called soft skills you mentioned before. The issue was the subject of parliamentary debate in Italy a few months ago. Critics feel that the recently proposed educational model is strongly influenced by the operating methods of globalized consulting companies. What do you think about the role that these private, often multinational consulting companies are exerting on shaping the future of both school and to a certain extent also higher education systems worldwide, not only in Italy, I would say. And if you see this role, what, according to you, what are the causes of these multinational consulting companies shaping the educational system much more than the democratic game of the National Assembly? Thanks.
So I think to answer that question sort of completely and systematically, one has to move beyond the educational system and into the labor market and also the organization of firms and production. So all firms do two things. One is they deliver goods and services to their customers. That's the production function. The other thing that firms do is they administer their own internal efforts to produce those goods and services. That's the management function. And the management function is extremely important for two reasons. The first is extremely economically valuable. Well-managed firms are much more productive and much more efficient than badly managed firms. And the second is it's extremely humanly valuable because the management function is the place in which workers control the conditions and direction of their own work. Now, one thing that's happened over the past 50 or 60 years, most dramatically in the United States, but increasingly also in other rich countries, is that the management function has been concentrated in an increasingly narrow executive elite. So that in 1960 in the United States and also throughout Europe, firms were managed by a wide array of workers, ranging from unionized production workers, because unions are a way of distributing the management function into the production workforce, through middle managers, through elite executives. And the wide distribution of the management function did two things. It made everybody have some control over the kind of work they did and the circumstances in which they worked. And second of all, it distributed the economic returns to management widely across the workforce and produced a relatively compressed pay scale in which all workers captured some of the returns to management. What management consultancies have done is they have restructured corporations to concentrate the management function exclusively in narrow executive elites and in management consultants. And they've stripped all the other workers of managerial control and discretion. So in the US, that's most dramatic, where unions have disappeared. You know, the share of the US American private sector workforce that's unionized today is maybe a fifth of the share that was unionized in 1960. But it's true throughout the world that unions have lost power. Workers have gotten shorter term contracts, have had less control over the ways in which they work. Management has been concentrated in the elite. And that elite, and now you see the connection to education, that new managerial elite needs a certain kind of educational training and pedigree in order to command its firms the ways in which it does. And so you have a feedback loop between education and the labor market, in which elites have restructured the labor market to favor themselves, and then are restructuring education to stratify education to produce the narrow elites that will then be needed in the labor market. So there's a cycle here in which, you know, the ways in which elite managers take control of firms and then bring the same methods to universities to remake universities in the image of the firms. And then, of course, the newly trained university graduates only further monopolize control in firms and the wheel makes another turn.
Thank you, very insightful, Daniel. I have a third question, which has to do with many believe that the aim of education systems cannot be exclusively practical, since they should, if possible, contribute to the harmonious development of the personality of citizen. And Michael Sandel just stressed this important feature. This perspective, which is probably typical of the past, especially of the aristocracy, seems to have almost completely disappeared in favor of measurable objective, if possible, and economic targets. This obsession with the ranking, of educational institutions, this is in part similar to the third question that I posed to Professor Sandel. So this obsession for the rankings of educational institutions may be considered as part of this framework. So it is also part of the meritocratic paradigm shift. Wouldn't it be desirable if to have a different model which would once again put society and the human person at the center of the social goals? Especially since, as you write, the current model is bringing unhappiness and dissatisfaction both to the elites and the subaltern classes. Again,
Look, I mean, this carries on some themes that Michael raised earlier also. Right now, our education system is an incredibly ruthless and precise two-way matching system. Students are measured, or applicants are measured, almost exclusively according to their performance on exams. In the United States, it's grade point averages, grades, and standardized test scores. Universities and schools are measured almost exclusively according to some ranking methodology, in which in the United States, it's a news magazine that does it, but it could be other institutions. In England, there's a sort of quasi-government system that ranks these institutions, and there's some formula that ranks them. And a lot has been said, to my mind correctly, about the ways in which this obsession with ranking and matching and eliteness is unfair, the way in which it excludes most people from meaningful opportunity. And that's true and important. Not enough is said, and this is something Michael was starting to get at, about the fact that in addition to being unfair, it's just intrinsically, in its own sense, destructive and even absurd. The idea that you can measure a student by adding up their grades in history and languages and mathematics and physics and economics, and then averaging them to produce one number that tells how good a student they are. This suggests that somebody who always is a mathematical genius and gets perfect grades in mathematics, but has a block and can't learn languages, is in some way an average student, which is absurd. Just as absurd as it is to say that somebody who is all round generally good at things, but not particularly passionate about anything, is also an average student. These creatures are completely different from one another, and the idea that you can reduce them to a ranking not only misjudges them, but makes a mockery of the idea of education. The same thing is true for ranking universities. The idea that Princeton University in the United States, which focuses on producing elite, globally relevant scholarship, and Berea College in the United States, which focuses on providing opportunity and upward social mobility for traditionally excluded students, should be rankable on the same scale, where Princeton is the #1 college in America and Berea College is the number 134 college in America. Makes a mockery of both of what they're trying to do. Berea College is not nearly as good at Princeton at doing what Princeton wants to do, and Princeton isn't nearly as good as Berea College at doing what Berea College wants to do. And to suggest that you can rank them in some way and say which one is better is a grievous insult to the idea of education. Now, the root of all of these distortions is the thought that the purpose of education is to build human capital, where human capital is understood as a set of skills that are measured by their price in the market. This is to measure people and training based on what Aristotle would have called their exchange value. That is to say, their value in trade to others based on other people's desires, rather than measuring education as what Aristotle would have called a use value. That is, its value in promoting the flourishing of the person who gets it. What education is really about is making a person more fully themselves, causing them to understand themselves in their environment, and thereby making them more authentically free. And that's a use value. It's something that conduces, that promotes the flourishing of the educated person, not something that makes the educated person into a commodity that they can sell at a higher price. And it's the commodification of people, which is what human capitalism is about.
Yeah.
That is the root of the need to rank and all these metrics, which are actually pretty good at measuring people's exchange value. They're just not good at measuring education.
Well, I personally agree, of course, but I just want to, give you, if you can give us a comment on the same question that I posed to Michael about the Italian student that making a similar it's like the American. We were familiar with the stress of the American students since decades, but in Italy, this is a relatively recent phenomena, and we wonder if what is your comment on the Italian student conditions portrayed by the Padua students?
So look, I think that it's important to identify two different stresses, maybe even three. The third, I'm going to go in reverse order of what I think is their real importance. The third is, it's just hard to be a student, particularly in a relatively underfunded university, because demands are placed on you by institutions and structures that aren't really quite suited to enabling you to meet those demands. You're asked to study in certain ways, but the libraries aren't open as much as you like, or it's hard to get books, or it's hard to get the attention of your teachers because there are too many students per teacher. And that's just a hard position to be in. And it shouldn't be underestimated when students express their unhappiness and unrest, how much of the most immediate cause is just those kinds of things. And those are important to deal with. Those are important to deal with because it's important in a university to provide proper attention and care to students. So that's the first, but that's not an ideologically deep problem. It's just a real problem. It's important, but it's not ideologically deep. The second, which is ideologically deeper, goes to this question of competition and ranking and prestige, and the feeling both that one is constantly precariously on the edge of being excluded from something that one wants, and that one has to assess oneself relative to others all the time. And that's a tough position to be in, and one that, as Michael said earlier, is destructive of learning, because it causes people to focus on the ends rather than on the actual practice of thinking and learning. And that's where the meritocratic ranking part of this is so damaging to students. But then the third, which I think is the deepest, is the idea that education is about building skills which will be assessed according to their market value. And that could go with the ranking part or it could not. I mean, it invites ranking, but it's different from ranking. And there, the point is that here's a way to think about it. As I said earlier, what true education is about is coming to understand oneself, understand one's world, understand one's relationship to one's world, in order to become more authentically free. That's what real education is about. But education that aims at producing skills is actually structurally committed to leading people to figure out how to make themselves more useful to others, not to deciding what they care about, but to identifying and then chasing what others care about, whatever others happen to care about. It's a little bit like the idea that honor is to be useful without fuss. But on this conception of education, what the student is trying to do is constantly to deform themselves, to satisfy other people without reflecting on whether the things that the other people want are actually good or worth wanting. And so very concretely, students who come into university thinking that what they love is literature or art or history or even economics or physics end up being investment bankers. Not because they think investment banking is valuable, but because at this moment, the market will pay for it. And so they distort themselves to satisfy somebody else's morally arbitrary desires. And that's a kind of an existential threat to the integrity of the person. And so to go back to my theme, real education makes you authentically free, but the education that we have pushes you to become inauthentic, to alienate you from yourself and then to exploit your own alienated labor in order to make money. And that's a source of, again, real difficulty, suffering for the students who push themselves through it.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you for this very interesting reflection you made and share with us. I now